this is actually a finely balanced war at the moment. So I think really the next 12 months, I mean, people say this every 12 months, that the next 12 months are going to be crucial. So we could always say that. But the truth is that both sides are still in this to win it. And that means, as far as we're concerned in the West, that we must help Ukraine to do so.
Ukraine has destroyed a strategically important bridge over the River Seine as it continues its incursion into Russia's Kursk region. British tanks are being used by Ukrainian forces in the offensive, which has forced the evacuation of almost 200,000 people. President Zelensky said Ukrainian troops were strengthening their positions in Kursk and called the captured territories an exchange fund, implying they could be swapped for Ukrainian regions occupied by Moscow in future negotiations. Well, earlier I spoke to Sir Malcolm Rifkin, former Foreign Secretary, and I asked him whether he was concerned about the use of British military kit on Russian soil. Let's talk to James Nixey, who's head of the Russia and Eurasia Programme at Chatham House. Hello, James.
Good afternoon.
Let me ask you first of all about those pretty dramatic pictures that we've seen of a significant bridge being blown up in Kursk. And apparently this is significant strategically because it was being used to supply Russian forces in the area.
Yeah, it does suggest that the Ukrainians are not just in for a smash and grab raid. In other words, they're going to stay in for not the long term, of course, but the short to medium term. And to do that, and in order to do that, they need to cut off the points of access to them. That doesn't mean they're invulnerable from Russian air power, of course. They still have to be careful, and the Russians will be as mad as hornets trying to get them out. And I do think that whilst I agree with Malcolm Rifkind in 99% of what he just said, that I think it does underestimate Russia in the sense that Russia will not be negotiating territory for territory, because the Russians and the Ukrainians, in essence, ironically, perversely, want the same thing. They both desperately want territory. Unfortunately, that territory is in the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine, of course. But the Russians are bent on it. They have annexed 4 regions beyond the Donbass and beyond Crimea, and they claim them as part of Russia. And of course, the Ukrainians claim them as part of Ukraine, and there's no getting around that. So I don't think we're going to see some sort of barter arrangement in Kursk as it happens.
How significant then do you think is this Ukrainian incursion into Russian territory? We're hearing indications from those close to President Zelensky that they don't intend to occupy it for the long term. What do you think is the strategy here?
Yeah, I think that's probably correct, although quite correctly the Ukrainians are using feints and deception in order to keep the enemy guessing, and therefore we have to be kept speculating as well. But the reality is that both sides do need to make more progress in Ukraine to achieve their respective war aims, as I say. So, and ultimately, that's why we're not heading for negotiations anytime soon, despite the onset of winter in just a couple of months' time. Ultimately, neither side is nearly ready enough. In fact, if either side were to sort of to get to the negotiating table right now, the leaders would not survive it. In other words, Putin would not be able to survive having gained so little as he has, and same with Zelensky. He would not be able to survive some form of shabby deal with Putin either.
So, what about the use of British tanks that have been used in this offensive? British tanks on Russian territory. Do you think that there are risks in that?
Well, the Brits have been almost as cautious as the Americans and the Germans in stipulating limits on the use of Western ammunition and weaponry and kit ammunition vehicles inside Russian territory. That does seem, as Malcolm Rifkin said, a perverse limitation to put on people, bearing in mind the fact that it does mean you're effectively fighting the enemy with one hand behind your back. It's not as if the Russians can do the same on the other side. So it is a peculiar limitation, but perhaps the success of the Kursk incursion will lead the Germans and the Americans in particular, and the Brits, it has to be said, to be less reticent and a little bolder in terms of what they allow the Ukrainians to do with the weaponry they're supplying.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem as though at every stage in this conflict, there's been, well, a reluctant to, first of all,
Yes.
to supply them with tanks. We were only going to supply armored vehicles, then we weren't going to supply them with jets, and so on. And gradually, those countries, including the UK, the US, and others supporting Ukraine, have provided more and more. We've got the Times today reporting that it is the US that is preventing Britain from providing or allowing these Storm Shadow missiles to be used into Russian territory. What do you make of that?
Yeah, it is a frustration that had we provided the weaponry that has now been given to Ukraine at the start of the war, back towards February 2022, then Ukraine would certainly have made a lot more progress and may even have won this by now. Because the truth is that this war can be won by Ukraine, but only if the West steps up to the plate and gives a lot more than it has already. And yes, it has given an unprecedented amount. One has to concede that. But of course, the scale of the challenge is also unprecedented. On as far as the Storm Shadow usage is concerned, then clearly it is not it would not be, in spite of the fact that the Russians are hit Kiev with impunity. Nobody is suggesting that the Ukrainians should be allowed to hit central Moscow. That does not make a great deal of sense because it doesn't help militarily anyway. But in order to attacking supply lines inside the Russian borders, which are being used for the battle in Ukraine, and oil refineries and all sorts of other areas which provide infrastructural support to Russia's waging of its war, that has got to be a legitimate target. And I do think that the reticence of the United States in particular, for fear of escalation, it would seem, but those fears have proven to be unfounded time and again. But maybe we'll see a change.
Do you think that we should be braced for a significant Russian offensive to try to recapture this territory or perhaps to strike at other parts of Ukraine?
Yes, the Russians have had no innovation in this war. They've not been able to take any first moves, apart from, of course, the very first move of entering Ukraine in the first place. So it is constrained, it's straitjacketed by a sort of a Soviet legacy, by corruption, by the fact that the Russian soldiers don't exactly know what they're fighting for, and the Ukrainians, of course, do. So the Russians have really been quite flat-footed, but of course they do have advantages in ammunition, over 5-to-1 ratio, and of course in sheer force of numbers of personnel, of soldiers. And that is not likely to change in the immediate future, I'm sorry to say. The Russians have still got more men they can put towards this, even if it's a risk. Mobilizing Russians is a political risk to Putin. He can still do it. He probably still will have to do it, but he'll put it off as long as possible. So there's just a lot more to play out. This is actually a finely balanced war at the moment. So I think really the next 12 months, I mean, people say this every 12 months, that the next 12 months are going to be crucial. So we could always say that. But the truth is that both sides are still in this to win it. And that means, as far as we're concerned in the West, that we must help Ukraine to do so. And it's still, I'm afraid, that despite new governments turning up in Europe on a regular basis, that penny has not dropped outside of Eastern Europe.
And what about President Putin's position? Because we have actually seen footage, haven't we, of some Russians in those areas that have been taken by Ukrainian forces, bewailing what has happened to them, calling for the leadership of their country to do more. We've reading that perhaps 200,000 people have now been evacuated. Do you think this could be serious for President Putin, or is his grip on his people just so severe that
Well,
there's no
yes.
real way that it can be shaken?
Yeah, I mean, I say this with regret, but I think I wouldn't underestimate the resilience of the Russians or of Vladimir Putin himself. He is in his 25th year as president, and he has faced serious challenges in the past, not least the mutiny or the attempted mutiny by Yevgeny Prigozhin just over a year ago. I think that this is a difficult one to ride out when your territory is being occupied, even if it's only 0.0068% of Russian territory overall. But the truth is that he does remain dominant in Russian politics, and there is no one really to challenge him. No one has the wherewithal and, quite frankly, the sheer bravery to be able to do so yet, as far as we know. But of course, that said, we do know that the war is not popular in Russia. And we do know that they are nervous of some snowballing effect of popular opinion or of some sort of implosion on the front lines with a chain reaction back to Moscow. So they are afraid of this, and if they're afraid of it, it means it is possible. But at the same time, and I hope not to contradict myself here, then I do think that Russia remains a resilient and quite a strong country still. So the Ukrainians have still got an awful lot of work to do.
James Nixey, head of the Russia and Eurasia Programme at Chatham House. Thank you so much for your insight.